Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. My name's Pat Webster and I'm here tonight to chair the meeting that we've got for you tonight on local government. I'm very pleased to bring this meeting to you and those people who are watching us on YouTube to welcome you tonight to hear about what seems to be the potential for some big change in local government. The potential's there. It's a very exciting time because there are lots of things happening, and I think that we'll hear tonight why this has come about at this time and also what it means for a region like Wellington, which has lots of issues going on that we all know about in terms of water and infrastructure and transport and whether or not the kind of local government we've got just now is the right kind of local government to see us over the next 30 years in these times of really big change. So I'm very pleased tonight to have the chair of our regional council and a person known to many of us here, Daran Ponter, to come and speak to us about the Wellington end of this sort of thing, and also to have Dr. Mike Reid from Local Government New Zealand, who's a policy analyst, a policy advisor, I think the word is, but who's been with Local Government New Zealand for many years. Both of the speakers have a long background in local government and policy development, so I think that they'll bring some really good insights for us tonight. So without further ado, Daran, if you would like to come up and speak, please.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. It's not tauranga, so I know that I can say that safely. Thanks for having us this evening. You're quite right. It's a big topic for the sector, and there's a lot coming at local government over the next 2 to 3 years, 5 years, and beyond. Before I get into the substance of the issues. With the review that the Minister's announced, I thought it might be worth just spending a little bit of time reflecting on what the Act says about local government and the purpose of local government, and then a little bit about the Regional Council. So the Local Government Act 2002 says that the purpose of local government is to enable democratic local decision making and action by and on behalf of communities, and to promote the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of communities in the present and the future. And you'll find that in section 10 of the LGA. The Act then provides a whole bunch of tools and direction in relation to strategy, planning instruments, the rating ability of councils, charging, regulatory powers, etc. Everything by and large that provides the ability of local councils to do their functions. The reason just for giving you a quick reminder about the functions of the Regional Council is that that's sometimes lost. There's a lot of noise, certainly in Wellington, about the City Council and what they do and what they don't do and what they say to each other, etc., etc. And sometimes at the failing of the Regional Council, we fly under the radar, and many of you in the room know bits of what we do, but we often do more than you interact with us on. So just a reminder of some of those things. Biosecurity and animal plant pest control, emergency management, so we fund and we coordinate the Civil Defence Emergency Management Group here in Wellington Region. Environmental planning under the RMA, so if you want a resource consent, often for activities relating to water or large-scale soil removal or air that have an impact on air quality, then that's the Regional Council that you come to. Flood protection, and so we manage the largest flood protection area by population in the Hutt River area. Harbours management, so many of you are not aware, but the Regional Council is controlling the movement of ships in and out of the harbour and in the Pororua area, and generally has a pollution control function for the entire region. We advise and support sustainable land management. A lot of that work happens in the Kapiti Coast and in the Wairarapa area. Regional parks and forests. We manage 50,000 hectares of land in our regional parks network. Some of you will have interacted with that, some perhaps quite regularly, but places like Queen Elizabeth Park, Belmont Park, Kaitoke, East Harbour Park, etc. We coordinate the public transport system, something that we were infamous for 2 or 3 years ago. It's got a lot better, but public transport is always the bane of any councillor's life in Wellington. Nothing ever, with so many moving parts, nothing ever works quite the way you would like. And in this region, we also provide the water that you drink. And how that works is that we provide the bulk water to the city councils, and they provide the retail water to you in your house and into your businesses. So we get that water from the Wainui-a-Mata catchment, from the aquifer below the Hutt River, and from Kaitoke Regional Park catchment. And all of that is fed through to Upper Hutt, Lower Hutt City, Pororo City and Wellington City. And I can tell you that those assets are very well managed, because we take the income that we get from you as ratepayers that comes when we charge the City Council, and all of that money goes back into the maintenance of those large pipes and that infrastructure. So the review of local government, I think the first thing to say about this is the most substantial review that's been undertaken since the 2002 legislation and the power of general competence, and a basic cleaning up of the legislation, but no general change to the purpose of local government and the scope of local government. So that's been with us, that purpose and scope has been with us since the reforms of 1989. And for those of you who recall those days, that was a time of 828 local authorities of one form or another. So from pest management boards to harbour management boards to county councils, district councils, city councils, united councils, catchment boards, they were all within that 828 local authorities. Nowadays we operate under 80 councils across the region, and many of those functions that were done previously by discrete entities have now been folded into district city councils and to regional councils. So we have a more streamlined local government than we had 30 years ago. In more recent times, we've had sort of 5 substantial changes since 2002. We've had the Auckland government reforms brought through by legislation to present one council, Auckland Unitary Council, which does the functions of the regional council and it does the functions of a city council. We've had various amalgamation proposals. Most recently for us, the proposals that Fran Wild proposed about 5 years ago to create one unitary authority for the whole of the Wellington region. We've had a number of legislative changes, numerous amendments to the Resource Management Act, the Marine Coastal Area Act, and electoral reform change. So the local government sector hasn't necessarily been standing still, but there's been no fundamental review of the instruments of local government. So 30 years on from the 1989 reforms, are we fit for the future, let alone fit for today? Do we have the right tools to do the job? Can we carry the expectations that you have as a community into the future? So the review of local government that Nanaia Mahuta announced a few weeks ago comes on the back of I think a frustration by government and a frustration within local authorities as well, that councils throughout the country have struggled to balance affordability and maintaining their infrastructure. And that's most particularly evident in pipe network infrastructure throughout the country. It's not just a Wellington City issue. It's come to prominence in Wellington, but it is pretty endemic around the country. Critical legislation such as the RMA having failed to deliver on its promises of change and better environmental outcomes a failure on the part of government and local government in following through on what the legislation promised and the instruments that the legislation provided for, but which government never picked up, and only recently has picked up, and therefore local authorities were poorly instructed on. And significant other challenges over the last 30 years, not least of which is climate change, and the need to consider things like coastal inundation and pest control in a different way than we have in the past. So the review's looking at roles and functions and responsibilities of local government, representation and governance of local government, and funding and financing. So that's a pretty broad scope. What it's not doing at the moment is looking at a reorganisation as such, but I'll come to that in a minute. So what the Minister of Local Government has said is that she's looking for a resilient and sustainable local government system that is fit for purpose and has flexibilities and incentives to adapt to future needs of local communities, that public trust and confidence in local authorities and local regulatory system that leads to strong leadership, that we've got effective partnerships with mana whenua, and we have a local government system that actively embodies the treaty partnership. So those are effectively the instructions that she has given to the panel that she has formed to do this piece of review work. I suppose a number of things to bring this back to the Wellington region that you can think may come out of a review, or just questions that we will certainly be posing to the review panel and the Minister during the course of the review. Under the roles, functions and partnerships area, questions about in the future how are those roles and functions split between councils and potentially between government. So we have a system now, highly centralised system in New Zealand, where most functions are the preserve of central government. And some functions via legislation are prescribed to territorial authorities and some to regional councils. And increasingly, there's a discussion, especially in the last 2 years, and particularly in the last 6 months, about regionalising more of those functions. So the Resource Management Act changes that are coming now talk about taking district planning and pushing that up to a regional council level, so that the regional council would become the administrator in some form or other, not very much detail at this stage, of the district planning process. Quite a different function for the regional council, not a function that we've ever taken in the past, but one that potentially then enables us to bolt together district planning ideas and concepts with environmental planning ideas and concepts that we already do. As we go through the review process, there are a whole bunch of issues that we could potentially be raising with the review panel. In the transport area, a simple question of why does the Ministry of Education continue to provide school bus services when the regional council throughout the country coordinates public transport and also provides many school services? In relation to the Department of Conservation, how can we get a greater synergy between the functions of a regional council and the local conservancy of a district council? Of a regional council in relation to our parts and network in relation to pest management control. Two areas that have similar, they're not the same, but similar functions and responsibilities, yet the gap between the Department of Conservation and the regional council is sometimes a chasm and is difficult to explain. Why do we pay for so many authorities as a community to work in the public transport space? We've got the regional council providing public transport services and coordinating the priority setting for large transport projects. We've got the territorial authorities, 8 territorial authorities in our region, who are the road controlling authority for their local roads. We've got NZTA, who are then controlling and funding the state highway network, and we've got KiwiRail doing their work. So 4 or 5 agencies within the public transport/transport space, and questions about whether that is part of this review exercise. And it's not out of form for us to be raising potentially some of those questions, because we have examples of different ways of doing that, not just globally, but in New Zealand. For example, in Auckland, the Auckland transport model. I'm not advocating for any of these things. I'm simply identifying areas where the review may shine a light on other examples and ways of working, and where the government may decide to proceed with reform. In the area of representation and governance, questions of whether we have the basis for community representation right on any of our local authorities. Are there different ways of approaching this? Is the one person, one vote STV system, is that the best basis for community representation, or are there other ways in which we can bring expertise to the council table at a governance level? In relation to funding and financing, how can we better regulate local authority spending so it appropriately meets current and long-term priorities? What checks and balances do we need to make sure that councils don't keep on digging new holes for themselves in terms of underinvestment in core infrastructure in the future? And what additional tools do we need to explore, all of us, in relation to how we pay for things? Because at the moment, we generally reach, as councils, for a rating tool, because that's the primary tool that we have at our disposal. Yes, there are other charges, like charges that you occasionally get at the library. In Auckland, there's a petrol tax, a congestion charge may be coming. But can we be more sophisticated in the way in which we charge and think about paying for the infrastructure that meets your needs? So congestion charging, fuel taxes, water metering, etc. Some of those things are coming, and the question for this review is what shape and form and time frame is that going to be delivered in, and how is the community going to be able to engage in those processes? So I suppose I and quite a lot of people within the sector feel that there's not a lot of indication of direction that has been given in the review. So the Minister quite rightly has set up a panel of informed individuals who are being set out around the country to explore with the local government sector and other sectors about what changes may be appropriate for a fit for the future local government. But one of the things I suppose that I and others in the sector can see is that what we're doing here is setting the table for reform, for reorganisation of local government. In other sectors, most notably health and the skills education area, we're seeing the centralisation of management functions. So the DHBs most recently, late last year, the tertiary education institutions, all effectively being regionalised or subnationalised, depending on how you see it. In Auckland, we already have a unitary authority, one council for the entire larger Auckland area. Wellington and Auckland both have water authorities, which don't exist in other parts of the country. So what I suppose we see is there's this review exercise that the Minister has instigated. We've got 3 waters reform coming at us quite quickly, which is most likely to result in 1 to 4 water entities for the entire country. So what is Wellington Water now will be potentially Lower North Island Water potentially also upper South Island water in as little as 2 or 3 years' time. What you know as Wellington Water, controlled by the Regional Council, the City Council, etc., will become a much larger beast, if you like, and there will be 1 to 4 of these entities across the region following the Scottish Water example that the government has leaned in on. What I suppose I see, apart from the Three Waters reform, what I see in the next 5 years is a much stronger emphasis on spatial planning. Local authorities generally in New Zealand, apart from the instrument of district planning, have been poorly equipped and poorly directed in relation to spatial planning, big spatial planning, thinking about the region as a whole, where our population is likely to grow, where our population should grow, where our population shouldn't grow. Those areas of fertile soils that we should preserve to be fertile soils for growing things, and those areas that are within corridors of development already, and we should encourage to stay as such and to become more so than they currently are. So in the next 5 years, I anticipate that through this reform exercise, through this review exercise and wider reforms that the government is taking, we will see a stronger emphasis on spatial planning and the government potentially investing only on a spatial planning basis. So every region having a spatial plan, the government will say, before we invest in housing or supporting you with new infrastructure for rail or roading, we want to see the spatial plan that underlines the rationale for that investment. District planning I've already mentioned as being something that looks likely to be lifted up to a regional level, and in recent weeks we've already been confronted with something as arcane as the setting of speed limits on roads now potentially becoming a function that is cleared by the regional council rather than necessarily by district councils. I suppose a number of other areas in which I can see scope for change and the need for stronger instruments is around coastal retreat. Again, something that is likely to be managed much more at a regional level than at a territorial authority level. A simple reality in terms of the parochial response that you get to issues like coastal inundation is it cannot be coped with by territorial authorities. They get inundated, so to speak, by their own ratepayers and their own interests in protecting their properties, and there is no way that territorial authorities can politically plan their way forward on that basis. And so you have to lift it up to either a regional or a national basis to be able to get the cut through that you need on an issue like that. And finally, I suppose, within the next 5 years, potentially, we are moving down a path where a regional transport authority for the Wellington region is possibly reasonably advanced as a conversation. Something that I suppose I've riled against in the last period, probably because of the response that we got on the buses. There was a lot of talk about, well, if you only got rid of the regional council and put a public transport authority in place, everything would be fine. And I suppose my response was, well, it's just not as simple as that. But actually, the more that you look at the myriad of functions that are already at play within the public transport space, there is a lot of sense of going down an Auckland transport model, but something that we would need to be actively involved with as a community rather than having it imposed upon us, as was the Auckland example. So I suppose at the local level there are some significant challenges coming to you. They are questions of localism, regionalism and nationalism. What I can see is that local government is going to take on a much stronger regional character, and where does community sit if that occurs? If we lift district planning, for example, up to a regional level, However we do that, where does community feature in that consideration? Balancing of community priorities. Again, if we push too many things up to a regional level, what you will inevitably find at a local level is that you're just a little less evident than you were previously. Not necessarily by design, but just by circumstance. And that already happens in our own regional council planning. As a regional council, the planning that we undertake is just slightly less sensitive to local communities than the planning that might be undertaken by the City Council on issues of place and space and local character and what have you. And consideration is that you may just lose some of that if you push too much of it up at a regional level. And finally, the issue of local representation. I don't have any particular views on that, but I can see the possibility that localism is lost within local authorities, or I think lost is probably the right phrase, and we already see that to some extent even within the regional council. So the Wairarapa is 3/5 of the Wellington region. We have one representative in the Wairarapa out of 13. That's done on a population basis. But that councillor deals with far more problems than any other councillor in the region by dint of the character of that region, the number of rivers, the number of fast-flowing rivers, the biodiversity issues, farming issues, etc. So we already see an inequity in the way in which areas are represented, not necessarily people, but areas are represented, and in the way in which issues are represented on the regional council. And I can only see that becoming potentially less inequitous, or more inequitous, unless we have mechanisms to try and adjust for that within legislation. So the Minister has announced that she's established the panel. They've got some time to get around the country until the end of September this year. They will then report to her, and then she will take some time, looks like a year in fact, and then in September 2022 she will come out to the wider New Zealand public with a set of recommendations for consultation, and we can only hope that there will be some logic and sense to all of those things, and that we can see, I suppose, we can see a future for local government and community within the suite of initiatives that they come up with. The intention at this stage is that a review panel will make its final report to the Minister in April 2023. So nothing in relation to this schema is happening within this term of government. So a lot of talk within this term, and it looks like the table is being set for the action to take place in the next term. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Daran. I really appreciate the fact that you have drawn it all together in a regional perspective, but also pointed to the difficulties about localism and the rationalisation of these things at the national level. I think it's really interesting that it's going to come up in September next year, right in the middle of the local body elections. It will be one of the more interesting local body elections we're likely to see for a while. So on that note, I'd like to ask Mike to come and speak to us about the broader picture behind all of this.
So I was just explaining, and we'll just turn down. For those of you who don't know, we are the Association of Local Authorities, so we represent all local authorities, membership body. We have to try and keep Kaikoura residents in councillors happy, as well as keeping the councillors of Greater Wellington happy, as well as keeping the Auckland governing bodies and local boards happy. So we have a somewhat schizophrenic existence. Hello. Another familiar face there. So I won't cover, I brought some slides which my colleague uses when talking about the current reforms, and Daran's covered a lot of that, but there's a bit of detail in the slides which will just add to that. So I wanted to make a much broad range of general comments about sort of what's going on at the moment and what that might mean for local democracy in general. And the first thing is, I'm actually fortunate because this afternoon I spent a couple of hours with the Future for Local Government review panel itself. They decided they need to have their first briefing with the oldest people they could find still working in local government, and I was one of those, in the hope that there were a few of them could remember how things used to work. And I was pleased that Donald Riesebos, who may or may not know, who's been in local government a lot longer than I, could turn up and say, yes, I remember the 1974 reforms, he said, and this is what we did. And we were all rather impressed by that. And I have to say that the review panel is a really committed group of people who want to do the best job that they can. If you don't know, they were selected out of a short list of 35. And the local government sector had the opportunity to put some names in their hat. The government put some names in the hat. I think my colleagues and our board at Local Government New Zealand were very pleased with the people who came out, and I've got their names in there, so I won't have to try and remember them. But that is, and it plays an important role in the process because the water reforms and the RMA reforms were they were underway, they were charging off on their own path, totally disconnected from anything else, which is not, I mean, we're talking governments here, they tend to work in silos, as we all know. And it was the sort of local government leaders and talking to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Local Government who kept saying, Prime Minister, we need to kind of think about what this means for local government and local democracy, and we need to try and join the bits together. And so that small task was given to this panel to try and sort out and solve. So I appreciate it's them and not me. So it was a really useful session we had with them this afternoon, and they took lots of notes, so that was kind of, I thought that my probably most helpful, maybe not helpful, but the one thing that I commented on that they all took a note, and one of the members wrote down and asked me to spell it, and I pointed out, I did my best, this is my personal view, that local government policy can best be understood as a synodoc, or synodoky, for those of you who don't know the term. I have to say I'd never heard of this term, you're probably really familiar with it, and I'll explain, till I read it in an article by a Lincoln University academic commenting on Nick Smith's firing of the Environment Canterbury Council because he wanted to sort of speed up dairying, or his colleagues did. And the academics at Lincoln did this really good article, it's published in Public Sector, pointing out that it was a synodoc, and so I had to go to the dictionary, I think, what on earth are they talking about? And it actually represents, in an economic sense, it talks about understanding something by looking at a part of it. Applied to local government, it means you understand local government by your experience of your local council. So when you look back the last 30 years of local government reform, you very quickly get to the extent, that ministers actually designed policies and changed legislation based on how they felt about their local council, which can be good or bad, depending on the nature of that experience. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of ministers who didn't have great experiences with their local councils, which is how I understand the real mess they tend to make of the local government legislation on a regular basis. But an example of that, if those of you don't expect you to study the 750 pages of the Local Government Act in great detail, but the 2002 Act has all of these provisions which are described as the Stop Auckland Council provisions. Because Sandra Lee, who was the minister, was an alliance member of Auckland Council, which was at that stage run for many years by the Citizens of Ratepayers, a right-leaning group. Sandra, of course, was far left, and didn't have, and clearly wasn't kept very much in the loop. It was rather marginalised. So she came to the obvious conclusion that local government was run by middle-aged white guys who want to privatise all public resources. So when she got to be minister in 2000, you knew what she actually had to do. She had to make it really difficult for those middle-aged white guys to privatise resources. So we have an act which is full of these provisions to actually stop them. Further down the scene, we know Nick Smith became minister, and his big frustration was that Nelson and Tasman should have been amalgamated a long time ago, so he immediately set out giving the Local Government Commission the power to amalgamate as many councils as possible, and which was going along fine. Nick lost his job for other kind of reasons, and then we suddenly had the attempt to join together Wellington and the Wairarapa. You probably all remember that. And they got something like 8,000 submissions against and about 10 submissions for, and at that point the government of the day decided they weren't that interested in amalgamation after all, and that disappeared from the scene. So let's look at some of these slides. So first off, Darren's covered pretty well here that we're looking at the government. First, where's the Three Waters in the scheme of things? We're expecting a cabinet paper in the next couple of months, which will kind of confirm the kind of parameters. I have to say, for the last 2 years, the Department of Internal officials have been going around holding meetings with local authorities around the country, and what they've come up with is effectively a series of bribes, which is saying, hey, first bribe was, hey, we really want you to join with us in creating these much joined-up water entities, and we'll give you a whole lot of money to do that. And the first tranche was last year as part of the COVID package. And it said, but we'll be coming to you in June this year with the second tranche of money. To get the second tranche of money, you have to sign a document to say that you will participate in this new entities, which is like, oh, our guys are sitting there thinking, you have to sign this paper and I get these millions of dollars to fix our water systems. It sounds pretty good, but you have to read the fine print like everything else. And the trouble was, there's no fine print, you know. So they have to sign these papers without actually having any idea of what it actually means in practice. And it's because they haven't worked that desperate. I mean, as we speak, there's probably about 30 or 40 DIA officials sitting around tables trying to work out some of those critical questions, which are actually really quite hard. As I say on this, we're looking at May 21, probably looks like it'll be June for the initial decisions. But here are some of the kind of questions they're having to work out. One, what happens if some councils say no? Well, I guess we won't die if it's Waimate, but we'd have a big problem if it's Auckland or Christchurch, because the whole basis of the reforms is that the government wants to improve water services and standards, which is great. It wants to be able to get people in Punakaiki to have good water because there's not enough people in the town to actually pay for it, and it's so expensive, Bulla residents don't feel they should pay for it, but it doesn't want to use taxpayer money to do so. So it's the officials' plan, this is the typical thing officials really love, is to go to a minister and say, Minister, we've got this big problem, which is about water quality. You know, we all know about Havelock, which is actually probably only, you know, go back to that. And we can fix it, it won't cost you anything, more or less, because the plan, effectively, they want to make these water entities so large, so you've got the cross-subsidisation. So Christchurch has to be in there, because Christchurch has to pay for the West Coast water improvements. Auckland has to be there because you've got extreme water issues in the far north, and the solution is to get that scale whereby you can share the prices, and that's okay, but I mean, it's not a very progressive way of taxing and redistributing wealth. It's actually a really regressive way, because what it means is generally poorer residents in the big cities are going to be paying for residents in other areas who won't necessarily be poor. We don't know, for example, when councils are going to have to sign up quite soon, most probably will, they're going to lose a big chunk of their balance sheet. So a small council, whose balance sheet might be 50% would be the water, the pipes under the ground, the water station, that will disappear. It will transfer to these entities. They don't know how that's going to work. My best guess is that they will pay the cost of any debt a council has got on its water infrastructure. That will be the cost, which just sounds fine, except if you're one of those councils whose water infrastructure is in absolute fabulous condition, because you've folded the investments and people are paying higher rates to keep that investment going, and you're thinking, hold on, our neighbour right next door has got rubbishy water infrastructure and they're getting all this money from the government. We're in really great state, and suddenly we've been really, we're not getting anything for it because we've already paid. Second question, of course, is the viability of a council. If you take away half its capital investment, you're taking away a big chunk of its expert staff. You know, in these small councils, you get one water engineer or two water engineers. They help the roading. They do engineering work for the community centre and the library, and you lose those. You have to bring a new person on. There may not be enough work for one. That's really tough. the new water infrastructure systems are meant to be governed jointly by iwi and local governments. So it'll be a small number of council reps. So we figure a way, in Canterbury, you've got 10 councils, and maybe put in the other South Island towns, but there's only room around the table for perhaps 5 or 6. So does the Christchurch rep have as many votes as the Greymouth rep? Good question. Will there be a Christchurch rep? So again, and in the South Island, it's fine. You've got Ngāi Tahu, a pretty organised iwi to partner with. But if you're the middle of the North Island Crown water entity, you've got 50 iwi, and you've got half a dozen councils. How are you going to fit there? Who decides? These are really practical questions, not theoretical questions. And of course, there are other questions that haven't worked out, and that's that question, is it going to be price harmonisation? Do different communities pay different prices? And how does it integrate? How does it interface? How does it interface with the planning system? So at the moment, if you're a developer, you can go to your local council, you talk to the transport person at the same time, you talk to the water person, you talk to the planning officer, you speak to the person who deals with recreation, facilities and services parks, you can put them all around the table and you can have a chat with the developer. The proposal is really to fragment those. So you will have to, how are you going to have that system fragmentation, integration? So these are all practical difficulties. I'm not saying this will necessarily be good or bad, but these are things that haven't been sorted out, and councils are having to make choices without knowing the fine print. The RM reform, I think, has got probably, and we know that there are going to be significance because suddenly, councils lose a big part of the balance sheet, they lose some of their revenue. Have they going to have enough income stream to keep the systems going? If you listen to the Mayor of Kaipara, Jason's on the news quite a lot as the champion, he thinks this is a plan for future reorganisation and amalgamation. And I sit there listening to Jason and thinking, actually, it's more a plan for de-amalgamation, Jason, because if you go back to 1989, we had this bright idea that we were going to put all our councils together so they were big enough to do some of these services like water and others. They just needed that bulk. Now that you've taken those big services off, they don't need that bulk anymore. You could actually redesign your councils so they're much closer to communities, which in some parts of New Zealand would make a lot of sense because the councils never worked. So 89 reforms didn't really quite work. I think there are reforms pose a real issue for us too. I should point out that in my organisation we're probably 4 or 5 policy staff and others, and almost everybody's either working on water or RMA reforms. And not much else is happening, I have to say, apart from that. This is proceeding, but again, the detail is being worked out as they go, and the concerning with this is that we won't see the detail till we see a bill in Parliament. So it's not, these are very top-down kind of reform initiatives. It's like, let's find a retired judge, give them the job, and when they come back, we'll just put it into practice. This is not an ideal policy-making process. One would like to say, we know the problems with the RMA. Could we have not started with some options that actually citizens we could have had some comments on and then come decide which is the best option? That's not quite where we're at. But anyway, I should say, what I was going to say at the start is I'm really delighted to be speaking with Daran because he and I first met each other nearly 30 years ago as the second-year students in the Victoria University's Masters of Public Policy class, the second time they'd been offered for people out of Wellington. And I came up from Christchurch and Daran came up from Hawke's Bay. I think you were a planner at Hawke's Bay. So it's really been delighted every now and then that we kind of cross paths and work together with me. A couple of things about the RMA reforms before I get to the future of local government. No, I've got time. Again, we have this kind of real obsession with what I think is right, is when we're dealing with governments, we deal with things called entrenched narratives. These are bright ideas that just keep bubbling behind the surface. It's like everybody who's employed has to kind of believe these things, and then they turn up in stuff like policy. And so one of those entrenched narratives we're discussing with the panel this afternoon is that big is better. Okay, we have this idea that big is always better. And that there's economies of scale, and we have to design our systems to provide for economies of scale. And there's a huge tension between that and democracy. That's kind of my role in life, is to keep pointing out that tension between scale and democracy has just really driven our reforms. And so this bottom point, which is on mine, is in red. No, sorry. It's not in red here. Yes. So it seems to be a big problem that New Zealand has 100 RMA plans of various kinds. And I think, why is that a problem? It's sort of untidy. And so they want to put those into 14. And so that's like 14 regions, as Daran was saying. The only problem with that, well, there are lots of problems with that. That means Wellington cities won't have a district plan of its own. Its plan will be the Kapiti plan and the Hutt plan and the Wairarapa city town plans will all be just one plan. And I thought, well, that has to be a pretty big plan. Maybe 14 small plans might be bigger than, or 10 small plans may be better than one massive plan with all 10 in them. Somehow our size is going to be better. So a big question about that obsession with, this is the obsession we had in 1989 when they did the big local government reform, which the review committee to some degree is going to be looking at to see whether it works. We needed to be, New Zealand local government was a fragmented kind of space. There were 828 different local bodies. And there was a sense that that was us, by definition, that was bad. So we needed to simplify. And what we did is we created a system. It didn't matter where you were. You could be in Greymouth or you could be in Auckland. The system was the same. So we ran Auckland City, one of our biggest metropolitan areas, exactly the way in which the West Coast ran Grey District, which seemed to make sense at the time, but pretty much we've come to realise actually provides really suboptimal results. And so in 2010, we had to redesign Auckland because it's a big city, it's a metropolitan area, and its governance doesn't have to be the same as a sparsely populated area in the South Island. So that whole desire for our sub-national bodies always to be the same is a real struggle that we have to fight against. So there were 3 plans suggested under the RMA reforms. So we take the RMA and we divide it into 3, get rid of it, have 3. One is a strategic integration spatial planning plan that Daryl's talked about. That's cool. And now the only comment on that, and someone else pointed it out to me as well, how can we really have effective 14 regional spatial plans if we don't know what the national spatial plan is? Somehow, these regions are going to figure out what the government wants to do. You may have noticed that Scotland is flavour of the month in this whole reform process. So typical officials, I used to work at council as David Close here, is one of my favourite councillors in the world when I worked at Christchurch City Council. And as officials, he has bright ideas, really great, and we'd really like the councillors to diet. So I know, we'll take Councillor X on a tour of the United States and show them new recreation centres. So, and suddenly they come back to the council and they're a huge enthusiast. We must have one of those too. So the officials took our minister off to Scotland to look at their different water systems, how they were run, and they decided that the Scottish model was wonderful, so we have to have one of those too here, just like the Scottish model. But that was fine. And then it's, hey, we better bring the Scottish engineers over here to advise our government and the officials on how to do it. So we've just had them over here. And then they've gone ahead and told us, how much it's going to cost and how much we would save if we went to their model. And you sometimes wonder, where's the contestable advice gone? But anyway, one of the things the Scots do is have a national spatial plan where the government has said, this is how we think Scotland should grow. And underneath that, you can have your local and regional spatial plans because at least then they align. I'm not entirely sure that regional spatial plans without a national overview is actually taking you necessarily that much faster further where we are, but which also actually goes back to a point. Daran highlighted some of the frustrations he has as chair of a regional council because a lot of regional functions can't be done at the regional level. And that goes back to some of the frustrations that we shared with the review panel today about the 1989 reforms of local government, which are actually heading in a really good direction. And they established regional councils, and they established territorial and district councils. And the sense was that those regional councils would be grunty enough to perform some significant functions, to join together, big infrastructure functions, to take over some of the social policy functions that government may feel it's too big to do. And then, who was the minister who came along after them? Can anyone remember? It's a W, not quite. Right. Pardon? So it was, actually they had his national colleagues had a nickname for him, I discovered, One Coat Cooper. Okay, what was the one coat in reference to? Painting. So his colleagues considered him that if you ever got him to paint anything or wallpaper, it would only be one coat, not second. So he was obviously quick over the mark. Anyway, Warren hated regional councils. In 1992, changes the Local Government Act totally destroyed the regional councils as a level of government. It turned them into RMA managers. And that has been an issue for us because we've been missing that scalable kind of way of working at a regional level ever since, and we've had to reinvent it by itself in different kind of ways. Anyway, so we've got the spatial planning at regional level. Local Government New Zealand, my colleagues, are pretty comfortable with that, really happy. But you ask, how is that going to happen? Who's going to do it? It's not the regional councils. Not at this stage, anyway. We're still waiting to find. There's some more details we don't know, and I have to tell you, there are officials at MFE burning midnight oil, thousands of them sitting around tables trying to work this out. They're actually talking about separate regional bodies just responsible for the spatial plans. Again, joint central government, iwi, local government bodies. We'd have to find a way of which councils get to go there, whose job is to decide the spatial plan. Not in consultation, not through a bottom-up process, but, top-down. The second piece of legislation, and I've got it here, which one is it? There is the Managed Retreat and Climate Change Adaptation Act, which they haven't really got. So here's the mandatory spatial planning and regional planning slide, sorry. But I'll go back. The second one is this one here, which is the Natural and Built Environment Act. And this replaces the district plans that Daran was talking about. Now, the second question is, who is going to do those? Well, guess what? A third regional body is going to be established to do these acts, to do this act. So it may not be the same group that's doing the Spatial Planning Act, it may be a separate one. Can you think of the number of planners it's going to have and the number of staff just to run district plans for that kind of scale? And who's going to pay for that? Some kind of levy on councils, I suppose. So again, and as I say, so you've got these three acts. One is the Natural and Built Environment Act, which does the kind of district planning. You've got the Strategic Integration and Spatial Planning Act, which I've talked about, and the last one you've got the Retreat and Climate Change Act, which we are really quite pleased to see. But the first two, just from a purely practical point of view, really struggle with them to some degree. And what does it mean for people who live in cities? That's where I kind of practical level. So one of the things some cities, Wellington bought into really strongly a few years ago, is called CEPTED. And it's called Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. How do you design your cities so people are kept safe? And I remember once talking to Laurie Gabates, who was working with Wellington City Council on that question, and they had problems with, well, it had come back again, but this is 10, 15 years ago, with violence in Courtney Place. And taking a CEPTED lens to it, they worked out that the reason the violence was happening is because people were coming out of the bars at certain times of the morning, they were all morning and night, they were quite drunk and they banged into each other and immediately, took a swipe at each other for getting in the way. And the solution was actually not that hard. Let's make the footpaths wider so people actually don't have to bang into. So that is an example. Again, looking at the way we design cities, a lot of people like to live at the end of streets. Not hard, quite easy to keep. Not that easy to keep yourself safe. Corridors, So it's how do you design cities so that they're safer? Well, how do you get one of these regional planning bodies to agree to Wellington City Council's desire to use CEPTED guidelines, but another area may not want to? Or the citizens come to the council and say, we think that the city should be an aged-friendly city under the United Nations, age-friendly cities regulation. How are you going to do that when the decisions are going to be made by what are appointed bodies? So the issue about both those two acts are they're highly technocratic. They're not democratic in any kind of meaningful sense of what you call democratic. They're appointed people making these kind of decisions. So very quickly, give you some time for chats and questions. Future for local government, and Darren's covered that very nicely. What I want to give you is tell you who's on there. Yes, so the seven members are Jim Palmer, who's former Chief Executive of Waimakariri City Council. I have to say, as a Chief Executive, he's been there 17 years, so he was very, very effective Chief Executive. He's a solid pair of hands. And our organisation has a lot of time for Waimakariri. A few years ago, my Chief Executive started a program which is now run by itself called Council Mark. They go and assess the performance of a council. They put in external assessors, they look at its competence around communications, asset management, financial management, human, etc. And the top-ranked council in New Zealand of the 40 or so councils that have done it was Waimakariri, and they just have such a competent team. And they've had a really competent mayor for many. So you had a case where you had a competent mayor who'd been there a long time, who built a strong relationship with a competent chief executive, and with that combination, you can actually do really good things at the local level. So Jim's great. Joel Ombler, who's former Deputy State Services Commissioner, he brings in the central government. He's like the adult on the committee. I've been around for a while, I know how things work. And then we brought Antoine Coffey. He's been working in the Bay of Plenty for many years, has been a councillor early on in his life, or an official, I'm not sure. Penny Hulse, someone we really love, formerly Auckland Council, before that Deputy Mayor at Waitakere City under Bob. And Gail Surgeler, who I first knew when she was at Ministry of Social Development here and runs what's called the Southern Initiative, which is a big community development project in South Auckland. And the Minister of Local Government is very keen on the work they're doing around social procurement. So Gail brings a kind of another sits in. So that's the group. Critical thing about what their time frame, and Pat mentioned September next year, just before the local government elections. Yeah, that's not so easy, because there are not going to be councils around to write any submissions on it, because they'll have just been voted in. And then during October and November, they'll probably still try to work out each other's names and find their way through the toilets and other things, and they won't necessarily be in a good position to respond to a really complex set of recommendations. Probably just to finish now on that, the three things is how are they going to go about it? And I've been actually sitting there and trying to write what they think they should say, but there are kind of three areas that I think they should focus on, which is kind of the first area is like, will local government, in its new shape, which means theoretically not being responsible for wastewater, drinking water, or stormwater, not having those resources or the staff, and probably not necessarily directly involved in setting district and city plans, and which we generally frame as place shaping won't be there, which is like a critical role. Will they be able to kind of fulfill their purpose of promoting wellbeing? So I always started, that's your beginning point. Will these new institutions be actually able, have the guts, have the powers and levers to do it, to really make our cities better places to live? The second question, and that's the impact of the reform question. The second question they need to look at is thinking of all the new challenges facing New Zealand. How well placed are they to deal with those? And most of that is kind of external challenges like climate change, and I think in some respects the government's taking a much greater lead on that. I'm not so sure that's going to be such a big issue where it is. It's about money. The third thing they really have to look at is, has the 1989 model of local government worked? And I think there's an awful lot of reflections we can make on that model, because you have to remember, going back to entrenched narratives, the 1989 model was heavily influenced by the kind of neoliberal agenda at the time. So that was, we need to strongly introduce corporate decision-making models into local government. So we turned our councils into boards, we shifted the focus from democracy to customers and all that kind of stuff, and what's working and what doesn't work. So those are three areas I think that they're really going to have to look at and review. So I hope that's helpful.
Well, there's so much in there to think about, and what I'm going to do is open it up for questions to the floor. Thank you very much, Mike, for giving us a very quick run-through of what is a very vast subject, particularly with all the other things that they're bringing in to the mix. I think the time frame sounds absolutely horrendous. Does anybody want to lead off with the questions? We have microphones here. I know you've got a voice like a fucker. I still think we should use the mic. Is it on? Yeah.
I'm Warwick Taylor. I'm the chair of the Wellington Residents Coalition, who's many times had petitions against water meterings and has been successful. So that's just a bit by way of introduction. I thank both of you, Daran in a positive way and Mike in a negative way, for raising the alarm. I'm wondering whether this is about localism versus regionalism rather than democracy versus technocratic corporatism. And the two things that worry me is these water entities and other entities, so-called representation by so-called experts. Often they're not experts in the field of whatever they're administering, but they're governance experts. And so you've got Wellington Water, for example, we've got two arms, it's not one arm's length away from representatives, it's 2 arms lengths away from elected representatives. And yeah, and then the second is the move away from general rating to charging for services. So do the two of you think that that it's more about a move to technocratic corporatism rather than localism versus regionalism?
Okay, fine. Thank you for that. Look, I think that it's very much in line with my own thinking, to be honest. I mean, for me, localism and regionalism aren't in opposition to each other. I think they fit quite nicely. There's some things need to be quite local. Other things are sensibly at a regional level. It's just getting that balance. It won't be consistent. But it does worry me, the fact that we are shifting to that kind of focus on experts as opposed to citizens. And the biggest worry is that actually, why will people bother to vote in elections if their councils, have got a limited role? It comes down to a question of salience. People vote where there's salience. If we reduce the salience of local government, you're not going to see so many people vote. But the big issue about local democracy, it builds citizenship. It's a place where people practice and learn the skills of citizenship, and we really need to encourage that, not discourage it. Yeah, however we do that. Yes.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's it.
So I tend to think that it's early days at this stage, but it does look like a more corporate type model, and it potentially looks less democratic. And I can't put my finger on any of that yet, but I just get that feel, and seeing some of the things that have gone on in the health sector and the discussion about how people will be how communities will be represented or not, worries me. But I just can't. There's not enough information coming through at the moment to get a real lead on that.
Grant.
Those of you who know me know occasionally I like to be a bit difficult, and I'm really feeling in the mood tonight. I'm going to challenge Mike on the citizenship argument, because I think I think on the left we have a tendency to get a little bit
Misty-eyed.
Misty-eyed, that's a
Thank
good
you.
word.
I just knew you were going to say it.
Now let's look at the reality. Accountability. Well, typically we have what? 50%, something in the low 50% voting. Is it 50% representative of the population? No, it tends to be very heavily skewed towards property owners. And similarly, the participation throughout the political system tends to be 2-3 city councillors in Wellington who are actually renters at the moment. That's unusually high in a city where 1/3 of the population are tenants. Part of the problem is that councils focus on what's important, which is getting people excited. No, they focus on what gets people excited and not necessarily what's important. Water crisis, how did that happen? Well, actually, no one really cares about it until it fails. So we have 30 years of underinvestment, 30 years on it fails, and suddenly it's important. What have we been doing for the last 29 years? Housing. I think arguably the biggest failure of local government has been around the way it's regulated housing supply. And that's been very much driven by the interests of property owners, not the future generations of property owners, the current ones. So the challenge there, I think, is how we sort of marry up this challenge between what we want as citizens and actually a system that delivers what it needs to deliver effectively.
Thank you. I currently need to reply to that to some degree. First point is, I actually think the current system, from a democratic position, is really poor. And so it has to be an awful lot better. It's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to the panel is to address those kind of questions, because, and has got poorer over the years. So if you're looking, if I'm looking, you just think overseas for a moment. If you look at the Republic of Ireland and you look at how they dealt with their constitutional question or the abortion question, they did it through a deliberative assembly. They brought citizens into the loop to help make those kind of decisions. And yet, if I look at Wellington City and the way in which governance has worked there over recent years, there are much less opportunities for citizens to become directly involved in those processes. So we've actually made those opportunities smaller and smaller, whereas I think the future for local government is quite the opposite, where it is a way which is much more engaged with citizens and they're far more involved in the process. I think that in terms of, the second thing is I actually think local government as a topic is not something you could ever generalise about. It's like for local government, everything's true and everything's false. And that's kind of its strength. Where's the counterfactual? So Wellington City has actually done a really poor job of managing its underground infrastructure. That's not local government, it's Wellington City, and it's great because actually other councils, doing perfectly well. Throw it all into one basket, which is the kind of, it's like the Trumpy thing. Actually, the whole of the country does really poorly. So I actually quite like the fact that actually different areas kind of perform differently. And we have to, I have to say, on the infrastructure one, I don't know if you've read Peter Winder's review of Wellington City Council, which I did because I have a particular interest in how councils make decisions. I just about fell over, when actually it was difficult sitting down, but when I came to the situation where it talked about how the council monitors its CCOs. So Wellington Water has always been held up as the bee's knees. This is the ideal way of managing water infrastructure ever since it was set up, just perfect. And Peter pointed out, and I assume he's right, it's a CCO and it reports to the council every 3 months. And that report takes 15 minutes, which is a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation and 5 minutes for questions. So Wellington City councillors spend 15 minutes, actually only 5 minutes of question time every 3 months about its water infrastructure. And I kind of look at that and I think, you have to be kidding me. Whereas, my days in Christchurch, you had a committee which met monthly on that one question, and councillors would put the water engineer in front of them and just simply say, what's the story? So we have allowed our kind of decision-making models to really slip from a point where citizens can actually keep their finger on the pulse and have outsourced it in a way which has actually diminished accountability.
Right, David first, and then I'll take the others. We have a visitor from Christchurch. I was going to say, no, you. You tonight. So
David Close, a visitor from Christchurch. I was on the City Council there for quite a number of years. I'd like to ask a question, particularly of Mike, about what is a fairly obvious solution to the underinvestment by local authorities in infrastructure. Back sometime in the 1990s, local authorities were required to produce asset management plans. As part of this process, staff had to estimate the depreciation of every item. So water mains, for example, were expected to last 70 years, which meant your depreciation rate was about 1.5%. Sewers are expected to last a bit longer, about 80 years. Reservoirs, 100 years, which meant your depreciation rate on a reservoir was 1%. Councils were then required to fund that depreciation. In other words, to rate every year for that amount of depreciation. You could choose whether you spent it on new assets or on repairing the old ones. But the principle was that you established your asset base, you worked out your depreciation rate, and you funded it. We discovered, when we did this first, that we were underfunding infrastructure by about 25 million. So we had what was technically an operational deficit. We gradually increased that over about 4 years till we were fully funding our depreciation. If every council was doing that, they would have enough, there's 110, 130 billion or whatever it is, over the next 40 or 30 years. And in fact, when I looked at the Christchurch City Council's long-term plan, they're funding already infrastructure for water, for sewerage, and for drainage at about that rate. So it's no big deal. If you're serious about it, you can do it. Now, unfortunately, the City Council lapsed after I lost that chairmanship of the Finance Committee and set down. But it's still nevertheless making a big effort to fund depreciation. And that's the answer. The shortage of money. So I'd like to ask Mike his opinion about that and whether he thinks enforcing that requirement would actually solve the problem.
Look, thank you very much, David. What I can say is actually councils have been doing that since your time, and they have been required by law to do that, and the Office of the Auditor General reviews their infrastructure depreciation rates and the degree to which they have adequately funded or not every year. And so councils have built up reasonable balances for funding and renewing the infrastructure. But they make their own internal choices about when they make those investments. A lot of councils actually, of course, they will borrow internally from those funds, but by doing that, they have plenty of debt room. There's only a handful of councils that have actually debt problems, and they are the growth councils, where councils are having to spend, they're having to borrow to build infrastructure for new development. And as the Mayor of Auckland said not long ago, it means they don't actually have the money to actually reinvest in the old infrastructure because of the shortage of funding tools that they've got. But actually all councils, but that doesn't mean they've necessarily all of them done. I was really surprised when the Mayor of Wellington said they didn't have much knowledge about of the quality of the underground infrastructure, because they should be putting cameras through them on a regular basis. I was just staggered, because most councils have much better knowledge of the infrastructure.
Have you got any comment on that?
Well, we're one of the few. So the Regional Council in Wellington is a bit of an anomaly in many respects. Mm-hmm. And one of the anomalies is that we provide bulk water. That's not provided by any other regional council in the country, including Auckland City, where it's done by Watercare. So we operate under the Wellington Water Board Act in doing that. That's the piece of legislation that we operate under. We tax every local authority on a volumetric basis for the water that they take from the regional council. So we do have a water meter, 4 of them. And we then take every cent that comes back from the district or city councils, and it goes back into the infrastructure. So it doesn't go on convention centres or new trains or anything like that. It goes back where it's come from. If we overbill the council, we underbill them the next year. So it's a sort of virtuous circle, if you like. So we don't have the same. So when you see water pipes bursting and what have you, touch wood, they're not regional council pieces of infrastructure in the Wellington region. They genuinely are city council pieces of infrastructure. And that doesn't give me any joy to say that. It's just a fact.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I guess the issue for us here is, in a democratic system, how do you know whether your councillors are actually on the ball in terms of these issues, or whether they're what they're actually doing, what decisions they're making? It seems to me that there's not an answer to that at the moment. Yeah, well, yes, and then who reads it?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm inclined to think that the application of David's panacea for the Wellington region fails to take into account its complexity, in the sense that the 4 cities collect about $1 billion a year in rates, plus the Kapiti Coast, I suppose, will be another 70 million or so. The point is that 75% of all that money throughout those 4 or 5 municipalities is spent on water and public transport. The democratic process associated with those things, public transport and water, is an absolute and unmitigated bugger's muddle. There's absolutely no way. If you want to make a submission about water to your local council, you'll be told that it's nothing to do with them. They own the assets, but it's all run by a distant organisation called Wellington Water. There's absolutely no point in doing it, and you cannot participate in decision-making relating to it. You could try making submissions about the quality of land transport and public transport and all that kind of thing. But again, you'll be told that has nothing to do with any of the four cities in the Kapiti Coast. You could try going to the Regional Land Transport Committee if you sort of have a level of optimism bordering on insanity, because it would simply, because they would agree to it anyway. Any submission you make, they'd probably agree to it because that's what they do. They agree to everything because they're a prisoner of 9 municipalities, and so you end up with this comprehensive book that's a book, you know, very, very, very much the same as the Book of Common Prayer, because the Regional Council simply does not want to offend any of its constituent local authorities. Well, that's not quite the right term. But is there any one, because I'm not surprised that people don't actually vote, because in many respects, all you can really have a say about is the residual 20 or 25% that the four cities are actually capable of dealing with, because they can't deal with the bulk of the stuff, the important stuff. It's nothing to do with them. I'd be interested in Daran's comments on, you know, what we should really be doing about that, because I mean, the structure is completely dysfunctional. And the really, on those matters at least, public transport, spatial planning, and water, it's absolutely essential that the authorities that are able to relate to the people and so on. And then as far as spatial planning goes, I think if we had had a history of spatial planning, it's very likely, as a region, it's very likely that it wouldn't be mucking around with Transmission Gully. I recall one proposal that existed. Sorry, I'll really hurry, because this little bit of it is quite interesting. The Regional Council studied east-west linkages because a third of all commuters in the Wellington region actually go east-west, they don't go north-south. But they're blue-collar workers, so they're not really proper people, most of them, so they don't really have a standing in all these things. There was a proposal that there be a link from say, from Waitangaroo through to the Hutt, a 7-kilometre driveway, and followed by a rail link, which would have a huge benefit to the region. It also would have possibly removed the need for Transmission Gully. That was presented to the four cities. Wellington said, Mayor Prendergast said, if there was going to be an east-west link, then it had to be a Wellington City land. Terra said, we don't want those people coming over here. Porirua supported and Upper Hutt didn't care. Now, it's impossible to properly manage local government in that sort of scenario. Anyway, so that I would like Daran to comment on all that.
So
we'll have one more question after this, and then we'll finish.
the question is where to start. It wasn't until you raised Mayor Prendergast's name that I could sort of locate some of those issues in time, at least, because I would have to say that the bunch of mayors that we have collectively across the region, of which I am a part, are much more joined up now in our thinking, in our attention to spatial planning, and in our connection, if you like, on our infrastructure network generally. So in, I think, the end of next week, we start the process for our regional economic development strategy and a leadership group that's been formed with 2 ministers being represented, all iwi of the region being represented, and all mayors and myself being represented in the first exercise in the region ever to start to bring a spatial plan to how we plan for the region, beyond district plans, beyond the sort of regional plans that we've had to date. I can recognise those conversations that you talk about, the myopic and extremely parochial views that people bring. That is going to get washed out of the system to some extent with the types of reforms that are being discussed. But my concern again is that as that goes, does local go as well? Does community go to some extent? I don't think it'll be dramatic, but it'll be just another chip away at community and the ability of community to see themselves in regional planning exercises and what have you. Everything will become just a little bit more vanilla to some extent in the way in which we plan and react to our communities of interest across the region. Yeah.
Okay. And the question up the back. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, guys. My question possibly reflects a bit of...
Is it switched on your microphone? I don't know. Can you? This one is. Right. Here.
Thanks for coming, guys. Thank you. My question was going to be, and it may reflect the fact that I haven't done enough homework, but what is the rationale for 3 to 5 regional water authorities? I'm pretty mindful that the current regional councils are based on pretty much established water catchment boundaries.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, you go.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and I can tell you that groups of officials have spent a lot of time on those questions. They probably start with 20. It's to do with it's actually a sort of a balance between. Go back a step. One of the arguments and one of the real advantages of the larger water models is the ability to raise finance. So they're actually wanting scale so that it can borrow. Now, the big issue with borrowing at the moment is that any money you borrow for your water services goes on your council balance sheet. And so the amount of debt you can invest in water is limited, and especially if in Auckland, you've very little headroom in terms of the amount of debt. It's more debt you can build. So they're looking for a size that can maximise the amount of debt they can take on in relation to I guess the sort of physical ability to do the work, So they've actually, they are actually using a kind of semi-rational calculation provided by Scottish Water, which simply says, in terms of geographic size, in terms of ability to raise finance, given the capital base of this area, and given the practicalities of doing the task, that kind of works best. And we think there will be 4. But that, I don't know where we have got that view from, but it is based on the sense that if there were too many, they wouldn't be able to necessarily have the capital base to raise sufficient finance. If there were too few, effectively scale, you move. I mean, what they don't talk about is things like diseconomies of scale, which start to happen when you get beyond a certain size. So all of that stuff's figured in terms of trying to work out what works best in terms of their objectives. Yeah.
Do you think there are economies of scale?
Pardon?
Do you think there are economies of scale?
No, not. Yeah. But there are other advantages you get, but may not be the big thing. Probably the one thing I'd never had a chance to say is what might local government look like at the end of this, and what might the future panel suggest? Because I think what they'll be looking at is, are there particular services that really aren't being done now locally that could be? And one of the questions, which I mentioned earlier, is with the health reforms being put into a small number of very large bodies, how do you understand what the health needs are of a community? And so potentially this is where your local authorities, thinking about a different type of local authority to what you've got now in a sense in terms of how it's run, could have a really important role in terms of being able to identify health priorities for these new health bodies, for example. Similarly, one of the things I've been trying to get over the line, totally failed for the last 4 years, is actually building local government's role in terms of pensioner housing, because there's a real hole there. We've got this emerging problem of older citizens who are renters, don't have the capital to get into markets, and Kaiagora does not cater for them. They do not meet the Kaiagora kind of criteria. And so again, I'm trying to get the government to say, actually, councils have been providing pensioner housing or elder housing for the last 70 years virtually. How about getting back into that and providing some kind of support? So there are probably a number of areas, where local governments are really well placed, like keeping older people in communities, a bit more like the Australian local government systems, because if you go to Tasmania or a number of the Australian states, they don't do waters, but they are more active around older services for older people and public health services. But these are up in the air, but those are the sorts of things that the Future for Local Government panel would really like to hear about.
I suppose I reflect on Carterton District Council. Lucky if they've got 1.5, 2 water engineers and what have you. A council like that, which has a population of under 7,000, is likely to benefit from this scheme. But a city like Wellington may pay more through the amalgamation of all of these authorities. So I think there will be some winners. Will it bring all of the efficiencies that it says it will? Well, did we see that when we had electricity reforms, I suppose, is my counter to that. I'm not sure that we did. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. Clearly officials and ministers seem to be convinced, but the evidence, the hard evidence of that hasn't been put in front of us yet. And may not be.
Thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank you for the questions and also to thank the two panellists for what has been a very enlightening talk tonight on what's likely to be happening over the next couple of years. And it seems to me that we've only scratched the surface of some really big issues about democracy, locality, about how we engage in these processes, and about how this vast inquiry and how it's going to be taken forward will actually be able to have our voices in it, those of us who want to be involved in that kind of thing. And if there's one thing I suppose we know about local government, is that it's one of those things that people ignore until something goes wrong, and then passions get very, very high. And I can see lots and lots of potential for flashpoints in there. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we will come back to this again over the next year or so, and I'll look forward to it. Thank you very much to two speakers. Thank you.